Soon our greatest endeavor begins. Long has the universe been a place of chaos, a flawed, unpredictable existence with no regard for order. No longer will the laws of reality dictate our limitations. Through the Nexus project, we shall create a state of perfection across the cosmos. The Elden legacy will be written in the stars, standing as an eternal testament to our rightful ascension.
Do you see? This is only the beginning of the truth. There is still so much to show you.
In today's video, I get to do two things I absolutely love doing. First of all, I get to play Our Perception of Beauty in the background because that's my favorite song ever in Wildstar. Like, go watch a bunch of my videos, it's everywhere. And the second thing, rampant speculation. Because today, on the fourth and final part of this lore miniseries, we are talking about something that we don't really know super huge amounts about, and we have to extrapolate a lot of things, because it is kind of the linchpin of the entire mystery of, like, Wildstar. We are talking about the Genesis Prime. Now, big spoiler warning first of all. While my previous lore videos have kind of gone into info that is kind of tangentially related to, but not entirely related to the main Wildstar story, we are now wandering directly into territory that could easily be considered major spoilers for the main storyline. So if you want to discover this stuff for yourself, I'd recommend switching this video off. Okay, we all good? Alright, let's talk Prime. First of all, this is going to get a little bit confusing if I don't define terminology here, because I am talking about a lot of different things and some of them have been named in interesting ways, so let's quickly clear that up. So when I refer to Drusera, I'm referring specifically to the blue ghost lady Drusera that we encounter throughout Wildstar. You know, the bush stalker, the one who's always kind of like watching you from the side. When I refer to the entity, that obviously is referring to, you know, the entity. And when I refer to the Genesis Prime, I am literally referring to the physical manifestation of the Genesis Prime that the Elden created. Why do I have to make this distinction? Well, it's kind of well known within Wildstar that the Drusera that we encounter a lot, you know, blue ghost lady, is actually a projection of a physical form. It's not real so much as it is just kind of a projection designed to interact with us in some way. The real Drusera, well, I'll get into that in a minute. The real Drusera being, you know, the Genesis Prime. So yeah, you get it. Drusera is the blue ghost, the Genesis Prime is the creature that the Elden created, and the entity is the entity. Let's move on and get started. So the entire purpose of the Nexus project was bound up in creating the Genesis Prime, a creature that could effectively defy physical laws and rewrite the very foundations of the universe to their will, and they succeeded. The first phase of this project was the construction of Nexus and the construction of 6 focuses, or foci, I don't know how you want to say it. The 6 primal focuses were spread out over Nexus and were designed to harvest enormous quantities of primal energy, each for one primal element: fire, earth, water, air, life, and logic. You can actually see a couple of these focuses in-game. In Galaras, we have the focus of air, which sits just offshore with like a giant tornado around it. You can actually see the focus of life in Wilderun, which is responsible for prolonging the lives of Tressain Toria and her blade mistresses. And underneath White Veil, there is the focus of water somewhere. Now, these focuses were incredibly important for the Nexus project because they needed a huge amount of primal energy in order to, you know, create their god, and would become even more important with the discovery of primal infusion, the ability to infuse primal energy directly with a living being. The Elden decided to test this principle on 6 of their own, which created the Prime Evils. I'm not talking about like Diablo and Mephisto and Baal from another universe. I'm talking about the literal concept of Prime Evil, which is to say the earliest ages, the original, the progenitors. These were the first beings to be infused with primal energy. There are 6 of them, chosen from the Elden. We really know about 3 of them. We know of Osric, the primeval of air, and he's kind of a demigod to the Falkren people. We know about Hydrus, who was created from the Elden Uria, who was probably certifiably insane, which is just another in the giant heap of bad ideas these guys had. And then we've got Vitaria, who is the primeval of life. Eventually, these would kind of be worshipped as gods on the planet Nexus, even though they were just kind of Elden experiments. Now, I've had a lot of trouble finding any way that this project directly relates to the creation of the Genesis Prime, and therefore I've kind of come to the conclusion that the creation of the Primevals was more of pushing the limits of how primal infusion worked, so that the Elden could perfect the art for their eventual work on the Genesis Prime, meaning the Primevals were essentially test beds, designed to test out the Elden's ability to create powerful beings utilizing life and primal energy. Now, I might be entirely wrong on that fact, so Carbine, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. So the Elden now know what happens when you infuse enormous amounts of a singular primal element into a creature, but what happens when you assign all 6 to something? This would form the basis of the creation of the Genesis Prime, their eventual creation of a god. They base this idea on a resource called Exonite, which contains equal amounts of all primal energies, and is an incredibly powerful and rare resource, known only to appear on Nexus. Now, the Elden toiled to create a device capable of combining all 6 primal forces into a singular entity, but never quite were capable of doing so, until the Archon Joriel appeared with plans to a strange device, called the Protoplasmic Resonator. Where he got these plans is actually a pretty big mystery that they're gonna reveal in Drop 7, and it's kind of a big deal. We're not entirely sure where they came from and if we should worry about that, because that might be one factor that led to the creation of, say, the Entity and the Strain, those universe-destroying creatures. While there was a lot of suspicion about this, especially from Coral, famous for being the only level-headed Elden ever, they eventually decided to go forward with it, and in doing so they had to select 6 of their own to be vessels of the Genesis Prime. Now, there was a lot of controversy and suspicion over the appearance of this protoplasmic resonator seemingly from nowhere, especially from Coral of the Shapers, who is famously the only level-headed Elden I know about. But they decided to move forward with the project anyways, with Joriel selecting 6 candidates to be merged into the Genesis Prime. These 6 are probably one of the worst ideas that could have possibly come out of this. We have Zarkonis, who is famously known as having a massive inferiority complex. We have Ionis from the Watchers, who's really the only level-headed one there. Balthior from the Evokers, who was incredibly egotistical. Aviel of the Weavers, who believed in the superiority of women over men. But it's the last 2 that really show the flaw in Joriel's logic. First of all, he nominates himself, despite the fact that he's basically the only thing holding the Nexus project together, and he nominates Nazric, a sociopathic, egomaniacal psychopath with zero respect for anyone outside of himself. It is just a terrible idea waiting to happen, and it does, almost immediately. But the time has finally come. The Nexus project is coming to its end, and the Genesis Prime is about to be born. Celebrations and all that good stuff are happening, but this is when things get much worse. Nazric, in his egotistical psychosis, decides that he really doesn't think that his consciousness should be erased in the process, and possibly he should be endowed with the powers of a god. Therefore, he and a knowledgeable ally, likely the one who provided the Elden with the resonator in the first place, in the hopes that his personality and consciousness will persist once they've been merged, makes an imperceptible change in the protoplasmic resonator. But the Nexus project is a go. The protoplasmic resonator is ready, and the imperceptible change will not be noticed for hundreds of years. The 6 are shunted into the machine, infused with enormous quantities of primal energy, and then merged into a singular being, the Genesis Prime. The Elden are pretty stoked about their victory, of course. They just literally created a god, and they dub her Drusera, a name for an ancient Elden god from their homeworld of wherever the hell the homeworld of the Elden is. Now, to have Drusera tell us this story from here, the Elden began teaching her how to do stuff. Suddenly they found the Strain, a mysterious creation that appeared from this being called the Entity, who the Elden then immediately tried to destroy, failed, and were wiped out. Drusera was basically helpless to stop any of this from happening for one reason or another. This is the story that you've been told by Drusera herself throughout the game, but it is not entirely true. In reality, the story goes a little bit like this, and we are getting into speculative territory here, because despite all of the information in the game, none of this is explicitly stated, but it can be inferred from information. So just understand that I might not be 100% accurate here, and Carbine lore guys, Pappy, all you guys, please don't kill me if I'm wrong. The Genesis Prime steps out of the protoplasmic resonator, and the Elden, super excited to know that they just created a god, decide to get right to work teaching her the extent of her powers. While it seems like no big deal to her, she manages to create sentient life on her own with no sort of catalyst. She's just able to do that. It is impressed upon her by the Elden that this is a monumental scientific leap, but she doesn't really seem to notice. The act was just so simple for her that it's like breathing or hanging out or drawing a picture. But there are also some strange anomalies that start cropping up. The Elden expected the Genesis Prime to be a blank slate in terms of her mind. They'd be able to teach her and impress upon her a personality, but this isn't entirely true. Over time, the Genesis Prime starts having little outbursts. She's angry, she's furious, she wants to do something or another, and they're not entirely sure where this is coming from because they expected her mind to be completely empty. This is, in essence, the change that Nazarick made, and it's giving rise to something incredibly insidious. Now, eventually, the Genesis Prime, during one of these little outbursts, creates the strain, which begins infecting things pretty wholeheartedly real quick. The Elden have trouble classifying this thing as they don't really know how to protect themselves from it, but they continue to laugh it off. I mean, they've got the power of a god on their side, or at least they think they do. Doing a little bit of inferring here, we can assume that the Genesis Prime gets worse and worse in terms of these outbursts and rage. Eventually, the Elden realize something very fundamental is wrong with her. What's really wrong? She's got a fractured personality. Her mind is broken. Eventually they realize that this really is a bad thing. To have a crazy person with the powers of a god is not super great or congruent with like the universe remaining existing. The Elden endeavor to destroy the Genesis Prime. They immediately fail at this task. But in doing so, they inspire the Genesis Prime during one of her outbursts to erase the Elden from existence. Eventually, the Genesis Prime comes out of this and realizes what she has done. She realizes just how deadly this disparate collapse of her personality is, and she endeavors to seal herself inside of an Exonite prison called the Lightspire. Now I can hear you already saying, what the hell are you talking about? The Elden were wiped out by the entity. You haven't even mentioned the entity in this entire thing. What the hell? She didn't create the strain, the entity created the strain. You're absolutely right. The entity is responsible for the annihilation of the Elden, it's responsible for the creation of the strain, and it currently wants nothing more than to wipe out all life in the universe and rearrange it into its new perfect whole. This change in the story that I'm explaining actually comes from a singular event in the game, the arrival at the Lightspire and the final discovery of the physical form of the Genesis Prime. Deep inside the Lightspire, we are given a glimpse of what the Genesis Prime actually is, a tiny blue lady sealed within tons of Exonite. But this also gives us another revelation.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't tell you. I was afraid.
Pathetic mortal. She cannot hold us for long. We will break free. We will perfect you. And then
Now do you understand? The entity is inside me. It wants to get out. You have to help me. There isn't much time. I must be free of this curse.
Drusera, the ghostly spirit who has led us here and has been trying to fight the entity for so long, and the entity, a creature of utter annihilation and destruction, are both part of the Genesis Prime's mind. They are in fact disparate personalities of the goddess herself. The entity, Drusera, and the Genesis Prime are one. Drusera represents the compassion and the grace and the goodness of the Elden, made manifest within the mind of the Genesis Prime and projected as a ghostly blue saint who floats around and tries to help the player on their adventures. She lies to us. She absolutely lies to us. She's clearly manipulated the story to make her and the entity seem like separate beings for one reason or another. But she is, in essence, trying to protect the universe from the entity. On the other hand, the entity is a force for destruction and change, seeking to rewrite the laws of the universe into its own twisted designs, and actually bears a lot of similarities with Nazarick. The entity, while in control of the Genesis Prime, creates the Strain, an incredibly powerful biological entity capable of remapping entire organisms' genomes. I wonder if that might come from its experience as being a progenitor, one of the most famous progenitors in the entirety of the Order, Nazarick. It may come from him, whether it's literally his personality or simply inherited traits from the change made in the protoplasmic resonator. The entity most certainly bears his calling card. These two forces, Drusera and the entity, are both parts of the Genesis Prime's mind and are in a war for control, each one seeking to overwhelm the other in order to take full control of the Genesis Prime's enormous and universe-rewriting powers. Whether Drusera wants to use these powers for good or for evil is not clear at all, but one thing is absolutely clear: the entity does want to use them for evil. It may result that the Genesis Prime has to be destroyed, or that the entity needs to be purged from its mind. One of these two is certainly an inevitability, and I think Drusera knows this. Whether she wants to live on or not doesn't really matter, because Drusera and the entity are inexorably linked. Perhaps we cannot have one without the other. We will need to find out as time goes on. This story is most certainly still being written. It seems that when you dig deeper into Wildstar lore, you tend to come up with more questions than answers, which is what makes the lore of this game so interesting to me. Drusera and the entity still have a lot to tell us. They really are the hinge of this story, and a lot could ride on their actions and ours. Who should we trust? Drusera with her cries for help? Or perhaps we trust the entity when he says that Drusera is not telling us everything? Or do we follow the Chua model and just nuke everything from orbit? Not that that would really help, but it would probably feel really good. These are questions we'll have answers to as we move forward, as the story of Wildstar continues to unfold. Hey there, thank you very much for watching this final episode of this mini-series for the Wildstar lore series. Don't worry, I'm just done this mini-series. I plan to do some more in the future, possibly of other games or more Wildstar. It all depends on what you guys really want to see. Sorry there weren't that many images on this one. It's kind of a tough subject to have images for in the game. But, of course, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Today's episode is brought to you by our Patreon sponsor, Levassi's Easy Living. Better living through Levassi. And viewers like you. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It means a huge amount to the channel, of course, as usual. And thank you very much again for watching. You all have a great one.